is an organization offering harm reduction education, emotional support, and community connection to people who are interested in the healing potential of psychedelic experiences. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that just became official at the beginning of the year. And we've started something that we call the Integration Fund, which is going to be offering what we call psychedelic scholarships to people in need, by which we mean we will be donating our money to get people psychedelic and also integration treatments as they become legal in various types of different ways. And speaking of legal, a few very important disclaimers that we also like to say at the beginning of every event. So the views expressed in presentations made at our event are those of the speaker and are not necessarily shared by our organization. A presentation at one of our events does not constitute an endorsement of the speaker's views, practices, or services. We do not encourage or condone any illegal activities, the purchase, sale, transfer, or use of any illegal substances, or partaking in any unlawful activities related to illegal substances. Please do not bring, buy, sell, transfer, or arrive on any illegal substances. Well, that's not so much an issue right here. You can arrive to this Zoom on whatever legal substances you like, and it's not my business. Or swap information on how to acquire them. Thank you for respecting our safe community space. So to introduce myself, I'm Tara Rodriguez. I am the organizational director of PsychedeLiA. This is actually going to be my last PsychedeLiA event that I'm putting on before I step down from my role as director and hand it over to Polyantico so that I can go pursue my master's in social work with the hopes of becoming a psychedelic therapist when that becomes legal. So I wanted to just say thank you all for coming to my last event. It's wonderful. And then I would also like to introduce our very special speaker, who I'm super, super excited to have here. Dr. Nicholas Powers is a poet, journalist, and professor. His book, The Ground Below Zero, 9/11 to Burning Man, New Orleans to Darfur, Haiti to Occupy Wall Street, was published in 2014 by Upset Press. And Dr. Powers is here to talk to us about bridging the worlds of psychedelics and activism. And I will go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Powers. All yours.
Good. Tara, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, PsychedeLiA Integration, for inviting me here. And also thank you for everyone who showed up, because there's a million and one things to do every day and every night, and you probably have Zoom meetings going on all the time. So I appreciate you showing up here. And so my experience as a teacher over the years has taught me that one of the best ways to do a presentation is to use vignettes and stories to illustrate points. And especially when talking about the kind of fraught and sometimes absent connection between psychedelics and activism, that the best way is not to kind of engage in too much jargon, but to try to give a little bit of a personal history of my journey with psychedelics, my journey with activism, so that at least the ideas are grounded in the body and they're kind of grounded in lived experience, and then kind of move on to maybe, some of the more kind of deeper entrenched analysis. So the first thing I'd like to say is that I grew up with the memories of an older generation. The first time I heard about psychedelics was through conversations really overheard with my mom and her friends. And so my mom was a Latina activist, a Puerto Rican activist in the 60s and 70s in New York City. And she, was kind of like a fellow traveler of the Young Lords and with the anti-Vietnam movement. And of course, she knew about the hippies, especially in Haight-Ashbury, which seemed like a world away on the West Coast. And so she knew of the counterculture, and she knew of LSD, and she knew about psychedelics. She didn't really take them that much because the community in New York was devastated with heroin. And so for her and for many of the people in the activist circles, psychedelics was something that was, maybe seen as a risk or as a danger. But I would hear these stories as I was growing up, as we walked to the bus, back and forth to the bus stop. And, so I heard of psychedelics at first, but it was always with a sense of kind of like a warning, be careful. The drugs destroyed the anti-war movement. The drugs destroyed the social movements in the 60s and 70s because people were kind of coming back and their eyes were glazed over and they had seemed like they were kind of like lost spirits wandering the streets. So that was like the first time I heard of psychedelics. They had the aura of kind of like yellow police tape, warning, warning, warning. And then as I got older and I began to get stories of history from the TV and from the radio and from the movies, I got another set of stories about psychedelics. And those stories were, of the 60s. And, you can imagine all the cliches, the tie-dye shirts, the drum circles, people barefoot at a muddy Woodstock and dancing with their closed eyes in kind of heavenly LSD bliss, and Haight-Ashbury and the Summer of Love. And so, again, I got the memories of an older generation. And so that was the first time I got the romantic view of psychedelics as a chemical that would wash the brain and let you see reality beyond the kind of materialism and ideology of bourgeois society. And one of the movies that really, really, struck a chord with me as a young man, as like a teen, was The Doors by Oliver Stone. So of course, you saw Jim Morrison, and he was tonguing LSD and singing and into like music festivals that almost looked like pagan gatherings as people circled the fire and were naked and throwing off their clothes. And that blew my mind away, because I was like, wow, psychedelics look like they make you a wild and cool person. I wanted to be like Jim Morrison. Not die at 27, but definitely I thought there was a kind of this romantic thing around psychedelics. So that was like the second kind of big narrative of psychedelics, was that they were this kind of entry into this romantic world of the wild. And so then when I got to college, that was the first time that I used psychedelics. So it's almost like 26 years ago, and it was nothing very political about it. We were all gathering in our dorm rooms, and some people had experimented with LSD before, and they, we all wanted to experiment together because we were free from our parents and free from our families. And we also, in a sense, wanted to be free from society. We were learning new philosophies, learning new histories in our classes. Some of us were going into the library and reading up constantly, and our minds were just expanding. And so we were told that, this chemical, LSD, was going to be like a rocket ship that blew us out of normal life and allowed us to see reality in the raw. And so, we were going to open the doors of perception. And so that, again, we were following through on the kind of romantic notion of psychedelics. And, there were a lot of silly hijinks and, slapstick comedy moments when, we were stumbling and bumbling through the halls, or we'd wake up and on the couch in the hallway and what the hell happened? And, or we would dance, silly dances. And, so some of it was comedic. Some of it was deeply profound, watching a sunrise on psychedelics near the river and just feeling incredibly at peace. And so, we had all of those experiences. But then, after college, the psychedelic use for me definitely, waned. And I was, busy in the kind of wheelhouse world of, at a job, making a paycheck, paying rent, pretty much like everyone else, nothing too big about that. And I thought maybe psychedelics had been maybe in the past, something I wasn't really, I was happy that I did, but wasn't really interested in doing again. And that it was a part of my life that was over. And now I was kind of, in the world. And so I moved to New York in 2001, and it was August 2001. And, I came to New York and I was getting ready for grad school, and I was, partying and getting my books ready and my classes ready. And then September hit. So September 2001, 9/11 hit, and the city was hit by like an emotional earthquake. The towers were falling. We were all worried about another attack. And it seemed as if the vibration from the towers falling continued long after the smoke had cleared, and all of us were vibrating in terror inside of our bodies. We were just, terrified and waiting for the next attack. And we were roaming through a city that looked like a giant kind of funeral, because there were candles lit everywhere, and you saw the photos of people who were missing. I volunteered, and other people volunteered to get supplies out. Well, that year was the first year I went to Burning Man. And when I was at Burning Man, I was at Burning Man, and I hated it at first. I looked around, and it seemed incredibly silly and stupid, because my city was dealing with, a pile of ash the size of a mountain, and everyone was running around having a good time dancing to EDM. And I was really, really angry. And so I was actually going to leave Burning Man early at my first burn. And so I was, fixing my tent at night, and I was debating if I was going to leave. And I saw this other guy, right a couple of tents away, and he said, "Hey man, how are you doing?" And I was like, I'm not feeling the burn. I think I might head out. And then he had a New York accent, and he could I guess tell mine. And he said his name was Tony, and so he said, "You're from New York?" I was like, "Yep." And we kind of knew everything. We didn't even have to say anything. We just kind of all we just knew. And he goes, "How are you holding up?" And I said, "No, I think I'm gonna go." And so he said, "Well, come over here." And I came over there, and he dropped ecstasy and acid in my hand. And so he told me, "This is not a cure, but it's going to open some doors. And I think you need these doors to be opened, and just trust the trip." And so I took it, and I left the camp, and I wandered out into the desert, and I felt, they call it candy flipping, but it felt like a chemical collision in my brain. And then everything just kind of washed away. My ego, my hard mask just kind of washed away. And all of the feelings from the past year kind of bubbled up and burst out. And I was in the middle of the deep, deep desert, far away from the city. And I was crying, and I was screaming, and I was punching the desert floor, and I was just letting it all go. And I must have been out there for a couple of hours, and, sitting there underneath the stars came down, and they almost, they looked like glitter coming down from the sky. And I just felt clean. And so when I wandered back to the city, I could join into the drum circles, and I could all of a sudden see the beauty of the burn. And I stayed for the rest of the burn, and I deeply, deeply enjoyed it. So then when I flew back to New York, this was the first time that I realized that psychedelics had a healing potential. And that healing potential came home to me when I got out of JFK Airport, and I stood on the platform ready for the subway to go home, for the train to take me home. And I was there with dust all over my face, and I had a poncho. And I realized that my body felt incredibly loose. It felt incredibly open. And I looked around at my fellow New Yorkers, and I could tell that their bodies were really, really, really tight. Everyone was still trembling and shaking. And I realized that psychedelics had accelerated the healing that needed to take place. It helped release the bottled up emotions in my body. And when it did that, it had sped me along to a place of relaxed, less stressed body posture that it would take maybe 5 to 6 years for everyone else in New York to get to. So that was the first time that psychedelics shifted away from the kind of romantic 1960s, Jim Morrison and hippies and, Woodstock and, mud dancing and all that stuff and rain, chants, to oh, this is a real thing. Psychedelics actually can help your body release built up tension and stress and emotions that are kind of locked inside the sinew and the nerves and get it out. And so that your mind can be clear again to actually, be alive and feel alive and be part of the world again and not be locked away inside of sorrow. So it was an amazing transformation. And that's, I think, where psychedelics finally kind of locked into oh, this is a healing and therapeutic. This is medicine. And so that's where that is the narrative now that I have of psychedelics, and it's maybe a narrative that has layers to it. So psychedelics, I could feel in my body as healing, psychedelics can also be a playful journey through the senses, where it liberates you from ingrained grooves of thought and habits, and so it frees your creativity. And then finally, to realize that psychedelics have different narratives, and to be aware that those narratives, that one doesn't have to be loyal to those narratives, but to be loyal to the journey itself with the chemical, and realize that it's going to have a different role in my life as I go through my life. It's going to have a different role in it, and to accept that role of psychedelics changes over time, and that's natural. And so to free myself from the kind of older narratives. So that was my kind of like journey with psychedelics. And so I've kind of landed with the reality that it can accelerate healing. Now, in terms of the relationship between psychedelics and activism, I think the adjective that most describes, the image that really kind of describes the kind of psychedelic counterculture in the United States and the world of activism and, you know, dealing with systemic injustice, is I would say I've experienced that there's a great divide. And yet there's also at least one intimate connection. So that great divide I've noticed is that, you know, there's obviously the medical model of psychedelic use, you know, whether it's, you know, the trials that are happening with MDMA, or, you know, the legalized work with ketamine and therapy. And that's the medical model to help people who are dealing with some form of trauma, to help, you know, free them. So that's absolutely needed. And, but at the same time, it's going to be very limited, because not many people are not the masses of people are not yet able to enter into those medical treatments. And then there's this other part of the psychedelic community, which is deeply connected in with the festival world. And, you know, like Burning Man, the regionals, but also so many innumerable, you know, smaller parties and raves that happen in, you know, the forest or the desert, rainbow gatherings, et cetera. And what I found there is that this community of almost like play therapy it's kind of like what we want the future to be, of playfulness and openness, and your identity kind of melting away as you dance around the fire. And at the same time, I felt that it was a world that was very, very, very much divided and separated. There was like these kind of bubbles of utopia that were separated from the masses of you know, real life. And that the activism that, you know, I began to be a part of was kind of entrenched in the street, you know, reporting from scenes of police brutality, which I started to do in like 2006. But the constant protest, for me, seemed like a world apart. So again, in 2001, shortly after 9/11, there was, of course, you know, the drums for war, like going to war against Iraq. And there was an anti-war movement that started very early, and, you know, and I joined it. And not as an organizer, I marched, and I was marching consistently. And sometimes I did street theater. And that the anti-war movement was then, you know, eventually followed by all the other movements that, you know, have kind of led up to this really intense peak that we're experiencing now with the Black Lives Matters protest after the George Floyd murder in daylight. And, you know, so I remember, you know, the anti-war movement. Then I remember, obviously, you know, Occupy Wall Street, and then the Me Too movement, and then Black Lives Matters, and then again Black Lives Matter. So it's like you can see the movements like moving in these kind of like peaks and valleys. But they always seem to be like, you know, kind of separated. And the one connection that, not the one, but a connection that I've experienced between them is that it was almost as if the social movements were like a bulldozer trying to clear away some of the most kind of violent forms of prejudice and oppression, and to try to bring into reality more equality, to generate more social trust, to create more love, to try to create more love in public. And it was like a bulldozer constantly fighting against the machinery, sometimes of the state, sometimes of organizations that fed on hate, but they were like a bulldozer constantly fighting against that. And in the space that they cleared was an increased possibility for everyday people to meet each other as who they really were, and not as people who are trapped in the roles in the machine. And I realized that the kind of utopia bubbles of the festival world could come in almost after the social activism and offer a space for people to act out that new freedom. And so that's the kind of relationship I've seen between the kind of social activism, which is, you know, a kind of bulldozer against violent forms of hierarchy that are based on falsehoods of human nature that condemn minorities or immigrants or people who are different from the mainstream to kind of like a subclass and try to excuse it based on nature or culture. And so they push back against that kind of violent forms of hierarchy, and they clear that space. And maybe in that space kind of follows the festival world, so that people can kind of act out some of the hopes that they've briefly experienced. Now, the one thing that I've always obviously, you know, felt going back and forth, whether it's from the Burn or regional or whatever, is that the protest also had an element of festival, but it was like an open air festival in the streets. So Occupy Wall Street, and right now there's an occupation happening at City Hall in New York, and there's also obviously the occupation in Portland, and they're fighting, you know, tooth and nail against federal agents sent in by the Trump administration to clear them out with tear gas and flash grenades and stuff. And they're fighting to keep hold of the square. But what I've noticed in the occupations is that the people kind of recreate society, and there's this incredible high voltage of social trust, because everyone's like recreating both the world, but they're also recreating themselves in the world. And so you know, when you go to those occupies, whether it's, you know, Occupy Wall Street, Portland, or at City Hall, people are sharing bread with each other. They're giving each other shelter from the rain. They're giving each other a place to sleep. And so what I found powerful about that is that a lot of like the ideas of who people thought they were can kind of melt away and get, you know, recreated in that spot. And I realized in some ways that's also what made the 60s and 70s so powerful. Because when I heard stories from my mom and like her generation, baby boomer or friends, what they said was, of course, the activism was important, but the activism was almost like the tip of the iceberg. That what was the bulk of it? What was the bulk of it was just that everywhere you went, there were other people who were in the movement, some part of the movement. Maybe it was the anti-war movement. Maybe it was the Young Lords. Maybe it was the American Indian movement. Maybe it was the feminist or queer liberation movement. Maybe it was, you know, the anti-poverty movement. But they were all parts of this larger movement. And so there was always a couch to crash on. There was always like a bottle to share. There was always a food to share. And there was always a party to go to. There was always dancing. And so it was that festival, the outdoor free public festival, that was kind of the glue of the bulk of the 60s, which allowed people to go back and forth in between different parts of the movement. And so I was like, oh, okay, I get it now. So that festival world is actually deeply connected to social activism. In some ways, it's kind of like the underground floating world upon which social activism rests. You know, it's kind of like the ocean in which the ship of activists kind of sail on. So that was a bit of that connection, you know, that I had, you know, between them. So now, you know, obviously in the kind of the context of the moment that we're in now, which is historically, it's lit. This is a very intense moment. We are, you know, there's this meme that goes on Facebook where aliens are watching Earth, you know, episode 9, season 3, and they're like, wow, this season really kicked off with a bang. So, you know, we have the pandemic that's ground the economy to a global halt. So more than 140,000 Americans have died from it. I have a really good friend of mine. His mother passed away from COVID. My downstairs neighbor, she passed away from COVID. The man who works at the laundry I've known for years, he came back gaunt. He barely survived COVID. So, you know, it's here in New York, it's definitely real because you can hear the ambulances wailing, you know, all afternoon and into the night. And so thankfully, like, you know, recently we've had like no more deaths from COVID. But I know in other places it's spiking up and it's getting really hard for a lot of people. Then there's the economic grinding to a halt. And so we're all kind of looking around. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd unleashed, ignited this kind of reservoir of anger at police brutality and racism that has swept not only the United States, but really all over the world, and kind of resulted with the pulling down of, mostly Confederate statues. And so, here we are. I guess, a good question to ask is like, well, what role does psychedelics play in the activism today? What role? It's slowly getting legalized in the medical model. It's there's some places like in Portland, it might be legalized, within, I think, the city. I think other cities have had initiatives to legalize psychedelics. Obviously, it's going through the trials to be offered as therapy. And there's some that are already available, like ketamine. So for me, I think one thing that psychedelics can do is intervene or make a cut on the kind of intergenerational trauma that has afflicted specifically communities of color. And again, this is so speaking from my experience. My family was lived in Brooklyn for a couple of generations, and then they dispersed. And then when I graduated, I came back to New York, and then I came back to Brooklyn. So it was kind of like an odd full circle. And there's a lot of shootings here, mostly by young men of color, Black and Latino. And I think that those shootings are the result of a lot of intergenerational trauma. I think that the legacy of segregation, like not formal segregation at first, but then informal, that has, quarantined communities of color into very poor parts of the city, and that legacy, is something you can see even now in the map of the city. I think a lot of the trauma from past generations have also been passed down, whether it's abusive parenting, whether it's the absentee fathers, maybe people who've been fathers who've been plucked away by mass incarceration and spent time in jail, and came back with wounds that they could not speak. And so sometimes growing up in that hard silence, I think young boys tried to find a way to find family in the street. But I've seen lots of shootings. And I think that especially for masculinity of color, for boys becoming men, that there is a lot of traps and pitfalls, and that there's a lot of self-destructive cycles that can get locked in psychologically. And one of the things I hope is that if psychedelics can become a treatment, that the acceleration of healing that psychedelic offers as a potential, that hopefully it could heal some of the young men before the cycles of self-destruction lead them to destroy themselves or to destroy other people. So that the slower forms of therapy, like talk therapy, et cetera, or role-playing therapy, may be good, but may not catch them before it's too late. And that maybe psychedelic therapy can intervene before it's too late. Second point on that is that one of my beats is poverty, because my family had a brush with poverty when I was young, and it kind of, got branded into my head. And so I have, pretty consistently gone to places in the world, both outside the U.S. and in the U.S., where poverty was a factor. So in the U.S., 2005, I went to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit, and obviously the poorest were the worst off. They had no cars, they couldn't get out, and they were the ones hit hardest by Hurricane Katrina and the flooding. In 2007, I went to Chad to interview refugees from the Darfur genocide. And again, it was the poorest people that were hit the hardest by war. I interviewed a woman who'd been gang raped, and I was talking to her in the refugee camps under the auspices of CARE International. So they were a humanitarian organization. I talked to men there who had bullets lodged in their knee from when they had gotten shot. And so I, just talked to dozens of people. And again, the same theme, it's the poor that always get hit hardest. And then, when I came back to the United States, again, interviewing from different crises. In 2017, I went to Puerto Rico, and I interviewed people there after Hurricane Maria. Again, it's the poor that got hit the hardest. And then finally, in 2019, I went to a homelessness encampment in Portland, and I interviewed homeless people there. And again, it's like people who have been stranded, just one bad stroke of luck and their lives plummeted from middle class into poverty, or some people who were born into poverty. And over again, you know, there was issues of addiction. There was sexual abuse. There was emotional abuse. People who were running away from homes, middle-class homes that were filled with shouting and curses over dinner, and they just couldn't take it anymore, so they ran. And over again, it struck me, you know, that one, people needed bread, they needed food, they needed housing, consistently good shelter, they needed safety. And then beyond, like, you know, the kind of hierarchy of basic needs, then they needed not only a safe place for their bodies, but they needed a safe place for their souls so they can begin the spiritual healing. And again, you can imagine that there's a lot of self-destructive cycles that are running around in the mind. And I thought that psychedelic therapy, the one, I think, relevant intervention is that its accelerated nature could hopefully capture, get healing done before, you know, the kind of grinding life of homelessness destroyed people, or whether it's through suicide or sickness, can catch them and hopefully maybe turn things around. So, you know, that's to me where I think the relevance of psychedelics can be now. Now, so I would say for the last kind of, you know, part of this is that obviously psychedelics have kind of like a visionary component to it. Is that, you know, what I've seen is that, you know, sometimes, you know, visions of the future can inspire people, inspire movement. But one way that vision of the future can even be possible is that if you're freed from the present moment, if you can kind of lose your attachment to all of the materialism that's happening now. And then if that's possible, to be able to kind of like peer, glimpse, you know, into the horizon and hopefully kind of catch a glimpse of what a possible future could look like. And so this is outside the medical model, and in some ways it's outside the festival model, but I think that there is a prophetic use of psychedelics that, to be honest, is something that is traditional itself. You know, if you can read in literature on the sublime belinginus, there's a talk of the oracle at Delphi taking psychedelics and kind of reading the future. And then, you know, from there you can read constant, you know, examples of psychedelics being used either by mystics, by people within religions, by spiritual seekers, as ways of kind of trying to see beyond the moment to something that is in the future. And then through that, hopefully offer a clear enough vision so that the activists have a chance to kind of direct themselves to that possibility. So I think, at least for now, for me, there's kind of three different kind of ways that I'm looking at, you know, psychedelics. There's like the vision, you know, there's the kind of, I would say the accelerated healing, you know, of psychedelics. And then finally, I think that there's just a playful journey through the senses that allows you to kind of get free of yourself and let your body be free. So with there, you know, I want to pause because I'm a long-winded teacher. I don't know if I took a breath this whole time. So I want to pause there and kind of open, you know, open the thing for questions and just kind of go back and forth. And I'm willing to answer anything.
I'm going to jump on and say that if you guys pose a question in the Q&A box, I'll go ahead and read it aloud for pretty much, for if somebody's just listening to it on video and can't read the questions. And then I will leave our speaker to answer it. All right, so we've got our first. Mark Stewart says, how would you define the underground or undergrounds, and how, in your experience, has it been beneficial to engage with?
Okay, so Mark, thank you. I want to be humble that I'm not like an expert. I haven't been everywhere on the underground, so I want to be humble before I even answer that question. But what I've experienced of the underground, you know, is that there are I think Hakeem Bey had a great kind of book that was very big in the mid-90s called Temporary Autonomous Zones. And the basic thesis of the book was that there have always been kind of like an underground counterculture in the United States, and really I think globally. And that this kind of underground met at kind of deserted, isolated places to be free from the rules of a hierarchical society, whether like in the Burning Man case in the desert on the playa, whether in the rave scene in the 90s, abandoned factories before they were, developed into condos for the gentrification. But there were always like these temporary autonomous zones. So I think the underground is a river of people who are hungry for freedom beyond rules, beyond the rules of society. And it doesn't mean that they are necessarily kind of anarchists, but in the sense they're kind of anarchists maybe of the senses, that they want to experience their bodies in a new and exciting experimental way. And they want to create art that, gives them joy. And so they meet in these underground places. And so I've kind of, I've taken a swim in the underground world, and I've seen that in the kind of spinning lights or in the dark corners where there's maybe like a kind of a purple lamp that came out of like the 19th century, and someone's wearing a onesies with like a unicorn, horn, and someone else has makeup on. It looks like the Day of the Dead, and someone else is like bare chested, and like everyone's dressed in these wild, fantastic, beautiful ways. And there you have like these amazing conversations. And so I feel like the flow of people and conversation in the underground goes to these temporary autonomous zones. So it's like the shadow of civilization. I feel like civilization kind of casts a shadow, and in that shadow is like these empty places where they can go. So how has it benefited me? Is that it showed me that new ways of thinking are not only possible, but are needed. It showed me that there is a hunger to live outside of price tags, to see the value of life outside of commodification. And also it showed me that there's a deep part in human nature to experience easy joy and silliness and fun and sensuality with other people on an easier, equal level without kind of judging if they're worth loving or worth engaging in. I think probably the hardest pressure that comes from living in everyday life is the way that we judge people and are judged by them. And it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen like the Terminator, like the Terminator looks at people and it sizes them up. It's like 160 pounds, this build, right? I feel like that's what people do intuitively. They size each other up. They're like, oh, this is a middle-class person with this complexion and that hair, and oh, they have this kind of car. Okay, I may want to talk to them, I may not want to talk to them. And so we kind of constantly are sizing each other up, oftentimes more subliminally, but sometimes it's very like obvious, like swipe right, swipe left on Tinder or something like that. And I feel that the way that the underground has benefited me is that it's reminded me that our deep part of human nature is that we like to dance together, we like to make music, we like to make art together, we like to make obscene jokes together, we like to create new experiences for each other. And what that does, it creates a heightened sense of like mirroring. And so, I don't know how many times, I was at a burn or like an underground party, and like someone just started ciphering, started doing some poetry, and someone else started doing the drums, and someone else was passing around the joint. And this beautiful poem, this beautiful music started arising out of nowhere. And then someone else came in with a saxophone, but it was like Kenny G, but he was like on acid. And then like all of this, and then someone else started singing. And then like someone came around with a cell phone, but using it as a flashlight, and like this light was spinning around us. And then it kind of all culminated, and we all then was like, yay! Then like, we all kind of drifted back into the party. And it's moments like that when you realize like how easy creativity brings people together, and race doesn't matter, gender doesn't matter, sexual orientation doesn't matter, class doesn't matter. Like all those things we think are important just kind of melt away in the joy of being creative. And so I find that it reminds us that there's a deep part of human nature that just wants to be like silly little monkeys with each other.
Thank you. Okay, the next question from Keelan Thomas. You mentioned a very recent medicine journey in the amazing New Horizons documentary. Could you describe how that experience has provided any new insights with regard to recent activism?
Mm. So to be honest, it was maybe less activism than how dealing with the stress of being in a city that's under quarantine. I don't want to be coy, but like it really was a medicinal journey. And so the really helpful medicine, um, it was kind of like a Zoom guided meditation trip, with a shaman on Zoom, which is beautiful but new and innovative. Like that's what we're doing now, Zoom guided shaman trips. Um, and I was I was scared, to be honest. I was walking in a city where like everything was quarantined. The streets were eerily empty. The city looked like a Hollywood stage set after the directors and actors and production assistants had all gone home. And so it was like, going through Hollywood at midnight when like no one was there. And it was just empty. It was very eerie. And on top of that, constantly getting phone calls and emails about people who had family who were dying of COVID or who were just enduring COVID. So when I went through that medicinal trip, I realized that like all of these emotions like needed to be released. And when it released, I was allowed to acknowledge something that I didn't want to acknowledge, was that I was scared. And it was hard for me to acknowledge that because I was like, oh, I can deal with this. I'm a reporter. I've been to, war zones. I've been to natural disasters. This shouldn't scare me. I'm above this. I'm tough. But I wasn't that tough. I was actually deeply kind of shocked by everything that happened. But I was wearing a kind of a mask of masculinity, and I didn't allow myself to actually feel what I was feeling because I thought I was above that. And so when when the trip like helped take off that mask, and I realized it doesn't matter how many places I've gone to. I'm a human being with emotions, and I need to experience them and let them out of my body. And so it was less that it connected to activism, but I would just say on a basic level, it helped me act. I was able to like be helpful to people again, because I now could tap into the fear that they were fearing, and I could approach it from a level of empathy. So instead of being like a drill sergeant, walk it off. You're a tough New Yorker. Walk it off. We've been through this before. Instead I was like, I'm scared too, and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and I'm afraid. And when I was able to open up my own fear, it allowed for the other person not to feel judged, and so that they could work through their feelings through a place of empathy rather than through a hierarchy of machismo.
Thank you. The next question is from Shanda Catrice. Speaking on activism, where do we go beyond George Floyd and beyond the trend right now to support Black Lives Matter? I am in a group where over 300 Black people have commented on wanting to learn more and heal with these medicines, but they do not trust all the psychedelic spaces as they currently exist, which are predominantly white.
Yeah. The thing is that there is a kind of an underground spiritual tradition within communities of color. So like, obviously my family's roots are from the islands and the Caribbean, which, means we're all kind of mixed. But the thing that the African diaspora and the kind of pan-Latinx world shares is what I would say the syncretic religious tradition. It could be voodoo, it could be Santeria. I remember my grandma cooking up some crazy smelly like jars of like Santeria juices. And I think she had this idea that the more horrible it smelled, the more powerful the magic was. And so she would get those candles from the Botanica that had like, whatever saints were there. But, there's already kind of a syncretic religious tradition that is very open to holding space as people go through a psychedelic journey, whether it is a sober one, which is induced maybe by drumming and by dancing, or whether it's one using plant medicines, but whether it's using legal chemicals, illegal chemicals, or drumming and dancing, the inducing of a psychedelic state, an altered state of mind, is deeply woven in with those syncretic religious traditions. Now, I'm familiar with that because here in New York, every summer, there's a ceremony to honor the ancestors. And Santeria, voodoo practitioners gather on the beach at Coney Island. It's, I think, almost the same weekend as the Puerto Rican Day Festival, Puerto Rican March Festival in New York. and everyone gets dressed in white, and they take these bowls of fruit and they offer them to the ancestors on the beach, and they kind of walk backwards, and then we dance on the beach drumming, kind of honoring the ancestors. And I know some people are smoking weed, but most people just kind of get into an altered state from the music and the rhythm. So I would say that one place to look is those syncretic traditions within the African diaspora, and that exists also within Black America, within the hoodoo tradition, or people who have explored African-based religion. So that's one. The other is that if you're not interested in that form of spirituality, I would simply say create one's own space. There are handbooks on how to use psychedelics. You can interview people who have used psychedelics and say, hey, how have you created a space? What are some of the things that you think are necessary? What are some of the protocols that would help people to maintain, dignity as they're being very vulnerable, and to kind of provide a container so that after they go through the experience, they have a way of integrating what they learned about themselves through psychedelics and integrate that into their whole psyche, integrate that into their personality. So I would say, have a setting, have a container, and then a way of integrating it afterwards. And so once you have that, you can create your own space rather than kind of waiting for a white psychedelic world to figure that out for people of color. I think that there are so many people who are very actually expert at it, but if you don't feel comfortable as a person of color going into a white space and kind of being very open and vulnerable, then we have to create our own. And that, I think, to me, may be one of the kind of best lessons. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, next question is from Melissa Moore. Two-part question. I'm a Black queer woman who does work with white folks to do deep racial equity and spiritual healing work. We also do non-plant-based traditional medicine / shamanic work with BIPOC people to do racial healing work to support working with racial trauma. I've also been interested and learning about psychedelics. Can you talk about how you see the potential for bridging the two? On a related note, in my experience over many years, festival communities are some of the most anti-Black places and racist spaces that I and other folks of color have experienced. How do you see that psychedelics can support transforming in that mostly white festival spaces / conscious communities? I have some ideas.
Good. I mean, I'd like to hear those ideas. So let me take the last question first and then go to the first question. Again, so growing up, I was exposed to nationalism, Black nationalism and Puerto Rican nationalism. And then from that, obviously, there's so many different forms of nationalism throughout history. There's, Irish nationalism and, there's Zionism, there's, Kurdish nationalism, take your pick. But the one theme across nationalism is that, to do for yourself, to kind of create your own space. Now, obviously, some forms of nationalism just recreate the very violent hierarchies that they're trying to escape from, So, there's some forms of nationalism that can just be as misogynistic and class-based and religiously fundamentalist as the ones they're supposedly escaping. But the reason I bring all that up is because the theme of it is to create your own space. So one thing I've advocated is for people of color to create their own festivals, create our own festivals, create our own spaces. And because there's so much land here, there's so many places, create temporary autonomous zones, find a woods, a forest, find a beach, find a place and a time that's empty, and invite other POC to come and to start kind of establishing a network. So instead of waiting for the kind of traditional festival circuit to quote unquote get it, one way is to kind of develop your own space. And at the same time, we don't live in isolation. We have to eventually create a multiracial working festival world if we want that festival world to be relevant to the real world. And the real world is incredibly multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-language, different religions, different dialects. So if we want the festival world to expand like it did in the 1960s to be kind of a container for activism, then the festival world has to be integrated. And so then that becomes the hard work of maybe creating workshops at festivals, creating camps at festivals that invite people in for different purposes to say, hey, these are some of the experiences that POC people had. Share your story. And then when that story is shared, I think it becomes part of the collective consciousness of festivals. And by the way, that's something that's happening with the Me Too movement. At Burning Man and other regionals, there was a problem, and probably will be for a while, but thankfully I think it is slowly diminishing, is the problem of sexual assault at festivals. And so there are organizations outside of Burning Man that worked with the organization to start putting up consent information, at the porta potty, so people can read, like, hey, make sure you ask for consent. Don't grab people. Don't just assume, even though this is a playful place. Respect boundaries. So that's raised the consciousness at the festivals. Well, the same thing I think could be done with race and even with class. And I don't think it's about like bumming the festival world out. I think it's about like lifting up the consciousness so that it's a space for the real world to actually be a part of, rather than all of us doing our separate festivals, which I think may be necessary at first. But ultimately, if we want the festival world to be a powerful social force, it probably has to be integrated. So that was an answer to the second part. But can you repeat the first question?
Sure. Let's see. It is. Can you talk about how you see the potential for bridging the two? The two being, it looks like doing racial healing work to support with racial trauma and psychedelics.
Yeah. And so one of the exercises that I do, and this is going to be like my nerd teacher thing, is like, one of the basic mechanisms of therapy is to speak the trauma out. And by getting the trauma out into language, the language now holds and carries the weight of that trauma, and it can now leave the body. And so one of the things I do is that I actually have, when I'm holding a workshop, is I have people write down in a notebook all their experiences, say, with race, and all the racial slurs that they were flung at them, all the times when they were dismissed, all the times when the intellect was doubted, all the times that they've had to work twice as hard. And so I have people write those down so they can begin to kind of get all those experiences out of their body and onto the page. And then sometimes, without putting our name on it, we rip that page out and we begin circulating it among other people. And almost all the time what happens, is people see those pages, they read it, and they're like, oh my God, the same thing happened to me. And they realize that they're not alone. And that's like the first step of, in a sense, forming an identity politics or a political consciousness, is realizing that it's not an individual thing, but it's part of a collective experience created by a system, whether it's a cultural system, economic system, a legal system, but it's something that's being recreated in many people's lives. So then once that happens, then we can kind of go to the next level of, how has this affected our personality? How has this affected our lives? And so I try to use writing. Now, I'm obviously tilted towards writing because I teach literature. Other people can use dance and writing, or just dance, or just kind of movement. One time during a workshop, I held pads, and I had people punch the pads as they were yelling the names that they were, that they had been, that had been all the racial slurs that they had dealt with in their life, and they were like punching it out. So some people need something more physical. But whichever way it is, that's just one way that I offer is workshops that bring in psychedelics. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't actually used psychedelics in my workshops technically. But I think that there are forms of therapy that, enhanced by psychedelics and maybe using some of the exercises that I just talked about, I think could maybe make a bridge between racial trauma that is oftentimes invisible, and also we think it's individual. We experience it individually and we think it's just us. But by writing it down, we realize it's not just us, that it's a lot of us. And so it takes the weight and responsibility a bit, off of our bodies and off of our shoulders.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like Melissa had said, great to see you, that the two of you grew up together. So that's nice. She's happy to see you. And then Shanda, at some point, she had a bunch of points that she listed in the chat. I've invited her to eventually hop on as a panelist really fast so the two of you can engage in a conversation, but she needed a little break, and so she's gonna let me know when she's back. So I'm gonna move on to the next question in the meantime. So from Sarah, Sarah says, thank you so much, Dr. Nick. As a Jew, I'm wondering if you could lend your thoughts on a recent influx of anti-Semitism that is on the rise as some sort of an odd reaction to the BLM movement. What is it about minorities in general that prevents us from uniting and incites us to split up? So many minorities and marginalized folks have experienced this throughout history.
Yeah, mirroring. The brain is a mirror. That's one thing I've experienced over and over again. That even as we're fighting against, say, police brutality and racism with a badge, that we've also have a cop in our heads, and we also can have anti-blackness in our heads, and that racism and sexism, ableism, all that those are within us even as we're fighting them. And that, you know, many of us have internalized that. You know, I mean, growing up, I saw people with all forms of internalized, people of color with all forms of internalized racism. So I've seen people who have colorism. They prize light-skinned people over darker-skinned people. I've seen, you know, people straighten their hair to the point where, you know, sometimes older sisters later on have patches coming out because they burnt their hair with chemicals, you know, but it's a form of trying to fit into European standards of beauty. And there it is. It's real evidence. It's burns on the scalp. I've seen, you know, people internalize materialism, thinking that, you know, if they get a good enough job and they get a good enough house and a good enough zip code, that that they're somehow immune from racism, and they begin to look down on poor people of color. So, you know, we've internalized that, and so it's not surprising that some minorities who are not Jewish have internalized anti-Semitism, because that's also part of the forms of prejudice that circle in the United States. Just like there's some minorities, women and men, who've internalized misogyny, even though there's like the incredible work being done by Black women in the Black Lives Matters movement. So what we have to realize is that just as we're doing the outside work, we have to do the inside work. And it's not about self-flagellation. It's not just about changing the language. And I think maybe, you know, this is where either therapy, whether enhanced or non-enhanced by psychedelics, is to do the inside work and to ask, you know, how have I not only benefited from some forms of privilege, how have I become so attached to some forms of privilege that they're just kind of invisibly supporting my life? And that when I'm challenged on it, I feel a reflexive protectiveness about it. And then at the same time realize there's kind of like a different way of using it, intersectionality. Usually intersectionality is like looking at all the forms of oppression, how they intersect. But I think there's also another form of intersectionality, which is looking at the forms of how privilege and oppression can intersect one body, and to realize that we're all multi-layered souls, interwoven with different forms of privilege and oppression that are crisscrossing us like the nodes of a spider's web. And so we may have privilege of being an American, but we may not have the privilege of being able-bodied. We may have the privilege of being able-bodied, but we also may have the disadvantage of being gay. We may have the advantage of being straight, but we may be darker skinned. You know what I mean? Like there's so many different nuanced ways the intersectionality works. And so I think coming from that viewpoint, and like to kind of try to approach each other with a sense of grace and compassion, and not a sense of censoring, not a sense of canceling, and not a sense of kind of Catholic judgment. I grew up Catholic, and I have to think about that. So, you know, so I'm just saying, like, approach people as complex human beings that are both advantaged and disadvantaged, and realize that we are too, I am too, and to try to approach that work together, saying that we all try to help each other get better, rather than trying to use our victimization as a status symbol.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna, at this time, promote Shanda to a panelist so that we can see her video. And there's a little pause there while it offers it to her. And there she is. I'm gonna try to pin her video so while she talks. All right. Hi, Shanda. I don't think we can hear you yet.
Yeah, we can.
I have to unmute.
There you go.
Yeah. So, what I wanted to clarify a little bit about my question was, I do think one part was answered, and I do definitely agree with the creating your own space. But I was posing the question just to put it out there for people who are not of color or are not indigenous to kind of think about that. Like, where do we go beyond the trend? I mean, right now you see everyone doing BIPOC circles. Even, me, I did initiate that myself, but you see every other group is doing BIPOC circles, getting asked by tons of people to come and train on diversity and inclusion, or train their psychedelic circles, which I think puts unnecessary labor on, and I'm going to speak from my perspective, Black people and people of color, which I honestly feel like goes back to the trope for women of being like a wet nurse. Like, you have to always tend to the person, tend to someone, the white person, tend to someone else, tend to the master, tend to the man, tend to someone else but yourself. So for me, I feel like the first step is Black people and BIPOC have to heal, and that could take a decade. We are exhausted. Do you know, me and my sister were talking about this the other day. Do you know what it, I know you probably know, but like, we were saying, man, do you know what it's like to have to go through the COVID and be a Black person during this uprising, and then have to go to work? Like, go to work where you're going to have to face this elephant in the room, this humongous elephant in the room, where my
Mm.
sister had to actually request time off because it wasn't even given. It wasn't naturally given. I mean, you are here in LA where people are losing it, and so they're so angry. And I'm not talking about people who were like, thwarting the movement. I mean, the pure anger of being exhausted, and it's scary to be in that energy. That anger can feel scary. It's palpable, and to have to
Mm.
deal with COVID and go to work. And then people, their response to it, everyone responds to it. Amazon, Netflix, everything they created a Black playlist, you know, of a lot of civil rights and slave movies, which is another
Oh no.
civil rights and slave movies does not represent artistry in the Black community. And so I was saying, like, where do we go beyond that? And I do think it is, we need access and equity. And I am on that boat of, people don't give you access and equity. You create it. And then when you
Mm.
create enough equity, people will ask you now to be a part of something. Do you know, like,
Mm.
I've been in this community consciously, intentionally for about 4 to 5 years. I have had speaking engagements snatched away from me. Even before I got to the speaking engagement, I got the third degree. I had to be interviewed by 1,000 people asking me all these things, blah, blah, blah. So this is what I'm talking about, that I realized I was exhausted. And I'm seeing these young people younger than me who really, really want this but don't know where to go. And so maybe that is the calling on my life and some other people to create these things. And I don't really feel like, you integrate right away. The integration
Mhm.
20 years from now. You
Yeah.
integrate or never.
Yeah.
You integrate when people's consciousness, without you having to do emotional labor, evolves. Like, the other day, Aware Project did a talk, and Oriana was saying, how are we taking the same substances? Like, are people of color taking the same substances as people who are white? Because we are doing this reflection and we are thinking about these things, but then from a privileged place, you're just thinking about yourself. You're thinking about, this is a wonderful trip. I feel love. I feel something. I feel connected to the world. I'm changing my life. But then you go on about your life. Whereas for us,
Mm.
a lot of people who are, and this is generalization, so I'm not saying that 100% of people feel this way, but a lot of BIPOC people are doing this to survive, to to liberate themselves, to live, so that you can just live day to day without being so heavily weighed down by stress and racism and trauma. This is really like people drowning. And so when I saw that and 300 people are drowning and asking, where can we go? Because they know that currently the way it exists, those circles will just finish the job of them drowning. And for me, I know it's like, talking to the wall or just reiterating the same thing that's been happening since civil rights movement. But I just feel like where do I see the accountability? Where do I see real action, real change, where someone else who is not Black, who is not Indigenous, or a person of color, who is not a queer person, picking up that baton and saying, I'm going to do this work for real and create spaces and learn how to create spaces that feel inclusive and not just diverse. Because everyone say, oh, our space is diverse. Diversity means nothing. I lived in San Francisco for 3 years, and people say it's the most diverse place on the planet. Well, it has like 0.6% Black people. So to a Black person, it could be like it is the least diverse place on the planet. And I had to leave because of that reason. So understanding what inclusion is different than diversity, and how inclusion really means you are centered. I'm thinking about you. I'm considering you. I am looking at things from your perspective, how to make you feel comfortable, how to make you feel welcomed. How do we set this up in a way? Now, and I do think a lot of BIPOC will be open to that. But I know from the BIPOC that I know in the circles I run in the groups I'm in, people are done with the emotional labor. People are done teaching people how to have humanity, how to not be a racist, how to not have supremacist thinking, how to not have privileged thinking. They're done. And this is, I do think, what you saw with the George Floyd uprising. Was that done? Was that enough? Enough is enough. We're done teaching you. We're done. It's like a clip I posted on my Instagram where Tupac says, philosopher and also rapper, but he says, like, if you have someone hungry and they're out on the street and they see you in there with that food, at first they're gonna sing and ask nicely, and then
can we have some food? Yeah.
Please, okay. But then next thing you know, they're gonna be busting down the door, and I think that's what's happening now. Yeah, with a gun.
Yeah.
Like, that's what's happening. You're seeing this now, and I think a lot of people who are not Black, who are not Indigenous, who are not people of color, don't understand why are the pow-pows and the banging down the door. Because it's like you've been in a Alice in Wonderland-esque land for a while that is beautiful, and you're doing your work, but you haven't been living in maybe the dystopia that a lot of BIPOC, have been living. And now the dystopia has been brought to your door in the form of COVID and the uprising, and people are frankly, excuse my French, losing their shit. But all that to say is that, one point was, if we ever are going to come and have unity, then the slack has to be picked up for real. And I don't know what has to happen for this to really break into the consciousness. I mean, I don't know how many ego deaths one must have before this really permeates down to the soul level, that people who are of the majority culture that is the work they must do right now. And then people who are BIPOC, you're going to have to probably create stuff and stop asking for things to be created, and stop asking for the fair treatments, and stop asking for this to be seen, stop asking to be heard. And when you go and create your thing and you do it and it gets big, guess what? Now people want to be invited to the party. And I think that is, well, I like what you said, is definitely where I'm at. Like, create it. And I do believe later, if it ever happens, you can come back and integrate. I do think the world doesn't change until it is a unified world. It's not going to really change. But right now you have a whole group of people who, the race started and they were held back for 30 minutes and they never got caught up. So we're spending a lot of our time just playing catch up. So that, that's where I think a lot of disparities are, is that, and that's why I think the access is like, you know, in your talk you did Horizons a while ago about like how blacks, you know, and the you know, the drug movement, the drug, you know, what happened in the 90s and the
Mm-hmm.
policing, and how we are like a little nervous and skittish around drugs because we know, like I have a friend when I was in college.
Yeah. What do you, yeah.
At 18, I have a friend in college that was sentenced to like 27 years for marijuana. Okay, you know,
What, that's
so like
crazy.
27 years for marijuana, and even still, those people are still in jail, and marijuana is legal, and they're not even letting them out. So the thing is, like,
Ugh.
we're coming from different places, and a lot of Black people don't have the finances to go to Peru, to go to Ecuador, to go to
Mm-hmm.
Amsterdam, blah 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 blah, you know. And then they want these medicines, they want the access, but then it's like they're scared to do it because they know that the law looks different. Like in that Aware project, Ethos said that, you know, I can't just go out and jump in a pool, you know, jump in the little pool or go scream in the middle of the street because, you know, people are not gonna say, oh, they're on the trip. Yeah, I'm gonna get arrested. Things gonna
Mm-hmm.
happen. Well, no one's gonna have compassion to say, oh, she's doing a little trip. I'm gonna get arrested, you know. And so for that, I feel like where people that are not BIPOC can help is if you have the financial, you know, capacity and ability, and then support some of these people and send them, you know, like if they want to go. I'm not saying that you have to insert yourself and tell people they need to go, but if people are wanting to go on these experiences, this is where you can even out access and equity, is to support organizations, support groups that can send people over to these countries to do it legally so that there is no fear of the repercussion of the law. Or even if, like in Oakland, I think now in Colorado,
Mm-hmm.
you know, create some scholarships locally that people can go to these centers or go to these places that are BIPOC and have these experiences that may not have the finances. And I do feel like that is, to me, skin in the game, and equaling out where like we're starting from different places.
I
The
hear you. I hear you.
end.
I wanna teleport both you and me to like Ecuador. It's just
Oh yeah, yeah.
just go
That's
on
on
our
my list.
trip.
That's actually on my
Yeah.
list. But
But
yeah,
also just
the end. Not to hijack your talk, but yeah, I think that just sums up and clarifies a little bit what my question was coming from. And also, like, I practice Lukumi, which
mhm.
is a preferred name instead of Santeria, but and it is that, you know, that what you said is true, those practices. But in all of these groups of men, these are people who are practicing already these traditions, so they're still
Mm.
wanting to have these experiences on top of already being in African traditional religions and
Yeah.
practicing
Yeah.
African spiritual systems and spirituality.
I hear you. I think and what you the part of what you said that resonates with me is after seeing, you know, my mom being burnt out by activism from the 60s, 70s. I mean, when I was younger, I saw obviously she was deeply, deeply burnt out, coming home with like rings under her eyes, just, trying really hard. And then as I got older, seeing activists, especially women of color, um, just burnt out by the activism, and that the idea of self-care is only now gaining some prominence within activist circles. It's been there as a practical reality, but it's only kind of now gaining ascendancy as like one of the things that we have to do is sometimes step back and take care of ourselves. Especially if I think one thing we don't often talk about is that, especially in the United States with the history of antebellum imagery, one of which was the imagery of the mammy, who is a Black woman who takes care of the white family, who sacrifices herself to be the wet nurse for the white family. And that was something that people assume is locked in the past like a fly in amber. But I don't think that it is. I think too many people look at women of color as wet nurses, as people who are, you're going to take care of everything for us. And, and I think it's this kind of implicit image that people haven't really flushed out and said, hey, why am I expecting this person to do so much work, right? So I think we have to kind of break that expectation of women of color, as Zora Neale Hurston said, being the mules of the world. I think she said that in like Her Eyes Are Watching God, right?
Yeah, definitely. But I was gonna say one more thing. Like, definitely, I like what you said about that, because in my own personal experience, like I am burnt out. I'm burnt out from college, joining the Black Student Association in the 90s to now, and joining every psychedelic group I can get my hands on, and being really, really, vocal in them. And I am burnt out. And every time I've been harmed, I've been either mobbed, attacked, kicked out of a group. And that's what they were talking about on the Aware Projects. Had a talk a few days ago, and they were saying the same thing. And all of those people on the set, well, a lot of them said they had the same experience, where when you talk about I've been harmed, you get kicked out of the group. So I've been kicked out of groups. I've been seriously mob attacked, like online mob attacked because I've been harmed. And then when that mob attack happened, the owner of the group, which is a actual nonprofit group, the owner, the nonprofit, they came to me and asked if I would like to give an workshop on the diversity and inclusion. And this is what I'm saying is the issue. Like, it's like the back to the mammy trope. I am wounded. And anywhere else in the world, if I fell down and skinned my knee, would you ask me to do anything? If I broke my leg, would you say, hey, could you help me get my groceries to the car? I know you broke your leg, but could you help me get my groceries to the car? Like, so when I'm wounded or harmed in these groups, I'm still asked to do the work to teach and heal others who only get angry and then want to erase you from the entire psychedelic community. But yeah, I can go on forever. But I've seen the light. I've seen the light, and I realized that.
You see, I've seen the light right there.
I have. I set my boundaries, and I engage with people who I do feel like honor those boundaries and respect them, and that is limited these days. And then I create the things I want to see.
Thank you, Shanda. Thank you. Okay, so we are getting close to the end here. Shanda, I'm going to move you back to your previous role. Dr. Powers, I'm going to ask you if you have any closing thoughts or remarks before I do my little psychedelia outro that I usually do.
So thank you, Tara, for being a great moderator, and for PsychedeLiA Integration, for having me here, for everyone who came in, and to ask questions, and, just to watch on a night. I appreciate you coming in. And I can say that psychedelics saved my life. I think it definitely at turning points, that it was the stripping of the ego and the deep perception inside of my psyche, and kind of, pulling out from that all that, like, kind of seaweed and like old beer cans and ticket stubs and all that stuff, and pulling it out from inside of me, and getting it out, and realizing that I had more space inside of me, a little bit like Doctor Who's telephone booth. It looks really small, but once you go inside, it's like gigantic. And I realized that, like, the soul is like that, it's gigantic and has a lot of space inside. And I think psychedelics saved me from, I think, a lot of self-destructive behavior that I kind of had internalized, like, loops in my head from being a man of color. And that's why I feel so strongly that the therapy, yes, therapy enhanced, could maybe save the lives of so many of people who are destroying each other in the cities. And I think that's, if there's anything that, if psychedelics could do that, that is a huge intervention in history that could make psychedelics, the narrative around it, shift dramatically into, wow, like, this psychedelic community really stepped in and stepped up. And because of that, there's a lot of people whose lives have been saved. And I think that's a great badge of honor to carry in the future. So hopefully that's something that we can aspire to. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for hopping on, especially since I know it's getting later over there on the East Coast, for making this time to talk on our West Coast time. It was really great having you, and I do hope that we're able to have you back in person at some point when all of this is over and we're back to being able to gather in person again one day.